Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you.
Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another
Questions of Doom.
In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, it's taken a bit of time to get around to answering this one. This email was sent to me on the 17th of December 2017, but this is a topic that I know people are still thinking about quite regularly, and actually it's very current. And even though I think we've sort of answered this question passively over the past few months, I think actually it's worthwhile flagging the question and pointing towards the answer in a hopefully a fairly short video today. So here we go. The question is as follows. Dear Mr. Soup and Co. I was reading news about a group protesting a development of luxury housing at Viewfield Farm, half a mile away from the site of the Battle of Culloden, and it made me realise that this kind of news is becoming more frequent. Where Culloden is obviously an important historical site and considered by many to be both memorial and cemetery, there are other places where protests occur, such as the Iron Duke pub in Great Yarmouth, as discussed in your watching brief in November or December last year. I'll link to it below. This one listed status basically because people liked it and thought it was pretty, or at least prettier than anything new. I'm concerned by this because despite having a strong interest in archaeology and history, I also have an interest in people and the future. I'm unsure about other countries, so I apologise to viewers who don't live in the UK, but it is a fact that houses are a very much needed commodity here, and surely looking after the current living population is necessarily more important than preserving underused or possibly unsafe buildings and pieces of land just for the sake of aesthetics, or even, dare I say, for the sake of history. Obviously, I realise there are many more points to consider and issues are more complex, but to follow the arguments of the protesters to their most ridiculous end, we would have to stop building altogether, as every bit of a country as small as the UK is probably precious or important to at least someone, or some people. I'm also aware that various bodies have guidelines and protocols to aid in decision-making processes in this kind of situation, but those decisions simply won't agree with everyone, whether they're for or against preservation. I wouldn't expect there to be a definitive answer or solution to this problem, nor am I even entirely certain of my own opinion, but I'd be very interested to hear some thoughts by professionals in the field of archaeology and heritage in general. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Pete, for asking the question, and again, apologies for taking a while to get back to you. I do think we have actually answered this question throughout various watching briefs and other videos in the past year or so, or 10 months. But I think this is also an opportunity to open up the floor in the comments below for people who are archaeologists and heritage professionals to sort of have a discussion. So that's one of the reasons I'm answering this question of doom specifically today. I suppose to really hit the nail on the head, you're right. You're absolutely right. The priorities of a living population absolutely should take precedence over history and heritage. That's just true. This was really highlighted to me in in like a beautiful sort of comic timing moment when I was interviewing James Gerard at Newcastle University. His office is directly opposite the accident and emergency unit in Newcastle Hospital. And just as we were talking about these priorities, an ambulance drove past. We could hear its siren blaring, and there's no way at all that any sane, right-thinking archaeologist would argue that archaeology, history, or heritage, or a building, or even, you know, even a castle, should be looked after ahead of providing emergency medical care, or hospital beds, or housing, safe housing, and also quality of life to living people. So you are correct. That's simply the case, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, this is, to a certain extent, an ethical issue. It is an ethical issue as much as anything else. But there is this element of extremes that people do seem to rush to in these instances, and that's on both sides of this this conversation. There are examples, for example, where you do have communities coming together and saving, and you know, I've mentioned this in passing with tongue-in-cheek before, saving a little section of maybe Breeze block wall because they used to play football against that wall when they were kids and they just really like it, and that means that there's a whole building project has to be ceased because this section of wall is listed now. And sometimes communities will even use that sort of tactic, and it is a tactic, to specifically keep projects from happening in their backyard. You know, NIMBYism, not in my backyard. One of the most notable environmental concerns, for example, is the great crested newt. I have a friend, in fact, who has deployed a great crested newt or two on a site because they didn't want buildings to go ahead too close to where they were living, so they put these animals there. These animals are protected by law, and you can't build where they're found. So people on that end of that spectrum, they do use the rules to save things that aren't necessarily in the national interest, and are absolutely about not in my backyardism. I didn't necessarily agree with this person's behaviour, by the way, and I did make that clear at the time. So people do that. There's also an odd situation where sometimes planners will just in case list a building because maybe it has a feature that only one or two other buildings that they know of have. There's a library building I can think of where the bookshelves were built into the wall of the library in such a way that this example, a slightly ugly example of 1960s architecture, was deemed to be special. And in the same way as you might list a Victorian pub or some other buildings, it was preserved and had to be people had to find a use for that building after it had ceased to be a library, and now it's a child daycare centre. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it actually it prolonged the process. It just meant that the council in this instance couldn't knock it down and sell it to a developer. They had to take a year to think about how the building might be used. And that's not bad for communities either, in so much as actually in that instance, if they had just knocked it down and built houses there, they would have been introducing a solid block of houses over the course of maybe 2 miles. Just 2 miles of nothing but houses, not even any corner shops, just houses. So there are examples where things that seem as though they're getting in the way actually aren't, and then I guess it gets even less insidious, I suppose, when you do come to proper historical sites, or even, for example, John Lennon's childhood home in Liverpool, where these buildings are protected, preserved, and flagged, and for a sort of national interest. The other end of that argument, though, is to say that if you continue with this, and as you sort of jokingly hint in your email, if you continue with this, we won't be able to build anything, nothing new. We need, we can't protect everything. This is ridiculous. And again, I agree, and I think no right-thinking archaeologist, historian, or environmental protection officer or historic environment protection officer is actually thinking along those lines. Yes, of course, you could make an argument that anything anywhere is worthy of note. But actually, as was highlighted in the most recent watching brief with regards to the Battle of Bosworth Field, the difference between a battlefield and a place where someone happened to trip once is so big that actually, if someone is trying to make the argument that all landscapes and all, all places in that landscape are equally historical, then that's a nonsense, and they really should be told to go away and think about what they've done. It's not that. We won't get to a situation where every single place in Britain is unbuild-onable because of a historical event, or at least we shouldn't. That said, though, also in recent conversations, it's been highlighted that some archaeologists consider this tension to be going in the wrong direction, in the sense of we're being too protective of historical sites, and actually destruction is an opportunity to learn something about the site. If we destroy it, and if we take down a building, if we dig underneath it, we're actually able to add to the archaeological data set. We should welcome all acts of destruction of all historical buildings and all historical sites, because it's an opportunity. But there again, I course correct a little bit as well, in so much as no, archaeologists are not looking to destroy a site just because they can learn from it. The ideal is to leave a site for future archaeologists, or for better sensing and technologies, or for other excavation techniques that might be able to get more data out of that location than we can today. So we're never rushing, or we should never be rushing to dig up a place just because we can find things. That's not an argument either, methinks. So there is a lot going on, and I can see why this has come to your attention, because these stories are more and more common. I think communities feel more and more empowered, as it were, to enact and to request a protected status on monuments, places, chunks of wall. But I think that the key here is, as you quite rightly suggest, it is those bodies who are responsible for the actual final decision making protocols and processes, and it's the conversations that surround those decisions that concern me the most, and I think also concern most right-thinking archaeologists the most. So long as there is reasonable protection of truly historical sites or genuinely interesting architecture, and so long as that architecture isn't actively dangerous or a fire hazard or getting in the way of building much needed homes, then I don't see why the two can't coexist in a way which is properly managed. A good example of this, and I'll try and sort of bring the video to a close on this, a good example of this is actually a site that I saw in Manchester recently, I think in Salford technically, just up the road from where my brother-in-law lives, where there's almost comically huge buildings which are going to be accommodation blocks, fairly high-end flats and apartments, on a plot of land that also has a Victorian, I think, pub, a pub that was I think Victorian or Georgian, but had been preceded by another pub. It was clearly quite a historical pub location, and what they've done is they've managed to keep the pub in place as a feature of that living environment, and it was going to be altered, I think, into a restaurant and maybe like a place where people can do exercise or play sports, this kind of thing, in and around that complex. But that was a sensitive and I think well managed conversation, though it looked like anyway from the glimpse that I got, because the architecture was being preserved. That feature, that pub, not dissimilar to the Iron Duke pub that you mentioned in your email, was being preserved, but it wasn't stopping people building on the land. And I think that's got to be the way forward, especially in brownfield sites, or so sites where there have already been building activity and it's likely that there's going to be pipes and bricks underneath the ground or whatever. Let good conversations and decent planning process move these sites forward to tackle the problem of the fact that we do need more housing, accommodation, houses, housing, bedrooms in Britain. But with all of that in mind, I think we also need to acknowledge that there are some sites that are and should be, for want of a better word, considered sacred, as it were, secularly sacred. Sacred in so much as they are special enough and different enough from the world around them that they do deserve not to be built on. And I think battlefield sites should be one of those types of sites. Now, I wanted to keep this video short and sweet, so I'm going to leave it there. But I think if you do look at previous watching briefs, since December in particular last year, I have been very careful to acknowledge that people have this opinion, that archaeologists are potentially just tree huggers, history huggers, and I don't want to give that impression, because I don't think archaeologists are simply wanting to preserve everything, because just consider the amount of Roman roof tile, for example, we dig up every year in this country. If we really wanted to preserve everything, I'd have to, frankly, the whole nation would have to start taking on its own quota of Roman roof tile to store this material. So we're not actually that nostalgic and that attached to every single little bit of history. But it is that moment where the community, potentially a community which either has a vested interest or a community which is not necessarily being advised properly, considers something to be so unique, so special, that they won't allow anything to happen to it at all, that maybe that conversation has to be managed a bit more carefully. And I think for the most part they are actually managed quite carefully. I think we also need to remember that news has an agenda, and when they're reporting on a group stopping a development, then they're going to take a side, whether it's for the group or if it's for the development. When they report on people, for example in Oswestry, and how they reacted to potentially building near the hill fort there, the news has an editorial perspective, and so it's easy to think that that this type of activism is taking precedence over actual house building. But really, in terms of actual house building in this country, it really comes down to government and policy decisions that generally speaking move and dictate how many houses are going to be built in different parts of the country. And then it's up to local authorities to sort of enact that will. So I know that's happened in North Tyneside, for example, in the past few years. The 20,000 houses, for example, was a number plucked out of the air. And it's how those things interact, I think, that's so important. Anyway, that's enough from me. Please do comment below, add to this conversation. Use this as a bit of a lightning rod for this conversation, actually, in the comments, because, as I say, I have been gently poking the bear and answering this question bit by bit, but I want this to be a point, I think, that we can point to for this topic, because I think it is particularly current when it comes to things like the Battle of Bosworth Field historical site in particular, where as we've covered in gross detail, there is a planning application issue, shall we say. Anyway, thank you to Pete for the question, and as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.